I realized that I was more than an ally. I was in fact queer. And yeah, I also had the, rite of passage of having a crush on my straight best friend. It's just a classic.
I swear it's a rule. Hi, I'm Lux Raven, the author of the Siren's Mark paranormal romance series.
Hi everyone, my name is Philline Harms. I'm the author of Love and Other Wicked Things, which is a sapphic witchy romance, and you're tuned into So Booking Cool.
So Booking Cool!
There's so motherfucking cool. So listen to So Booking Cool.
Welcome to So Booking Cool. It's Jewel B. Happy Pride Month, or whenever this reaches you. Here is author with two resonant Watty award-winning novelists from the queer community. Lux Raven, best known for the Siren's Mark series, which has been read millions of times. Her combined works on Wattpad amount to nearly 4 million reads. And Philline Marks, whose sapphic romance Never Kiss Your Roommate alone has over 3.2 million reads. Her newest work, Love and Other Wicked Things, along with her other stories, amount to over 9 million reads. Stay tuned as these two authors engage over pride and authorhood in general, only on So Booking Cool.
Hi, I'm Lux Raven. I'm mostly a paranormal romance author, although I do some contemporary romance. I'm mostly known for my Siren's Mark series, and I write a lot of pansexual, bisexual characters, and a bunch of disabled characters as well.
Hi, I'm Philline Harms. I write mostly queer young adult stories and fantasy. I have 2 published novels with Wattpad books. And when I'm not writing, I'm pursuing a master's degree in clinical psychology and psychotherapy here in Germany.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. So we're glad to have you both here today for author on author. You know, there's something called actors on actor, right? So we want to flip it and see what you guys have to bring to the conversation, okay? About authorhood and more, and especially pride.
I love this. I'm so excited. The first question in the little briefing sheet we were given is, when did you become drawn to writing, and what kind of writing was it? I can just go ahead. I first started writing when I was in elementary school, so I think pretty much as soon as I was able to write letters. I started out with short stories, as one does. Then when I was a teenager, I got into the fan fiction to original fiction pipeline. So I started out writing fan fiction on Wattpad. And then eventually I wrote my first story with my own characters. And yeah, that's what I've been doing ever since. What about you, Lux?
I feel like it's similar. I feel like almost all the writers I know, like we started writing super young. It's just like you figure out that you can do it and you're like, oh, I have things to say. I'm gonna start. I definitely went down the fan fiction lane too. I didn't like find Wattpad. Like my era was the fanfiction.net era.
Oh yeah.
But like I discovered Wattpad later in just 2019 when I started hearing about After and the movies that were coming out, and I was like, oh, I want to check this out. I want to see what this is about. And so I had like a little career in journalism for a while, and I wasn't in love with it. But then I kind of pivoted career-wise, and I just started doing Wattpad for fun, and kind of came back around, and people really liked what I was writing. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. This is really fun. I'm curious, like, what fan fiction stuff did you write? Like, what fandoms?
I started out writing fan fiction for Shadowhunters, or the Mortal Instruments, the book series.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I used to run an Instagram fan account, and so it went from there. What fandoms were you in?
I was kind of all over the place. I was really into this show Nash Bridges, which is like definitely made for like old white men.
I'm not familiar.
I was just like, it was like a cop procedural show, and I was just really into it. And I had a fan site as well. And then I got into down the Twilight Road and the Vampire Diaries and all that stuff, and I was deeply obsessed, and I I had to be a part of it somehow, so I had to get involved in the writing of the fan fiction.
I love that so much. I feel like it's so typical. Like whenever I see like any author, my first question is like, how did you start? What fandom were you in? Because like 90% of the time, that's how it started.
Well, and I was talking with a group of authors at WatCon, and we were all talking about playing the Sims games and playing like with dolls and things like that, and how it's like this natural progression where you start like writing stories and not realizing you're writing, you're just like you're acting out scenes and you're like playing with dolls or video game characters or whatever it is, and you're like trying to make them act out your stories. And it's just kind of this natural progression, like you want to get more involved with the stories.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, as a child, you are so into role plays and stuff like that as well. So I think being a writer is a lot about holding on to that childhood fantasy, that fantasy world that you could tap in so easily then. So yeah, I think that's really nice.
I've always thought too that like childhood mindset, it
Hmm.
is so good for writing when you can get into that mindset of like play and having fun, and like
Hmm.
instead of necessarily like following the strict rules of what makes good writing or like what school
Hmm.
tells you is good writing, when you can kind of take it down to the bare bones that you had in childhood, where it's I want to see what happens and I want to play and explore and I have ideas and I want to expound on those ideas. Like that for me is always when I do my best writing.
Yeah, 100%. For me, it's really hard to kind of when you start getting more popular on Wattpad or when you start getting into publishing, I feel like other things kind of start to, I don't know, get your attention, the reads or the amount of followers you have or anything
Mhm.
like that. But I think that childhood imagination is really at the core of it all. So yeah, I've really been trying in these last few months to get back to that. So I've actually been writing short stories once again, which, was what I started out doing. And it's been so wonderful to like get back into this very low stakes mindset of I'm only writing this for me. This is play. And if it doesn't end up like, if it doesn't turn out well, I can just scrap it and move on.
Yeah, I think you have to kind of remind yourself that that is why people are here for you and that's why people like you.
Mhm.
It's like you doing what feels good and natural and what you're interested in, because there's that instinct, especially with social media, and when you start looking at oh, like reads are doing well for this or not doing well
Mhm.
for this thing, there is that instinct to try and change and try and like you know format yourself in a certain way that's going to be
Mhm.
palatable to readers or that readers are going to respond to, and like inevitably that doesn't do you any good. It's always like the instinct like, oh, if I do this they'll like me more or something, but
Mhm.
I have to kind of remind myself like, oh, like my writers liked me when I wasn't trying too hard, when I wasn't like trying to conform to what I thought they might like. they're
Mhm.
I think they're people just like me and they like reading what I like writing, and so if it's fun for me on my side, it's usually fun for them.
Yeah, exactly. That's why, like, my number one advice for new writers is always write what you want to read. Because I feel like, yeah, readers can sense that passion that you have for a project. Like, the biggest compliment that I can give to any book is I felt like the author was having fun while writing this.
Hmm.
I feel like that really shines through.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess we can move on to more Pride Monthy themes.
Yeah.
I mean, today's Pride Month. Um, so when did you first come to know about Pride Month?
It's- like I have no idea. I feel like I kind of just like, for me it's like, oh, Pride Month has always been a thing, right? Like in the back of my
Mhm.
mind it was there somehow. I know in high school, I was one of the founders of our Gay Straight Alliance, and we did a lot of activities for Pride, but we also did a lot of like rallies and things for various like political causes, like making sure schools were safe for all kids and things like that. And
Mhm.
so I've always been very like immersed in the LGBTQ world, and I think it was like it's funny, I kind of got involved before I really understood my own queerness. And I was just like, oh, I really, I don't think it's right that people aren't, being loved and accepted for who they are. And I want to get involved as an ally, and in
You
my
were
mind,
such a good ally.
I'm a really good ally. I'm very committed. But and then somewhere along the line, while I was in that club and starting that, it was like, oh, like maybe I'm queer, maybe because I'm bisexual, and so I always liked guys, and I was like, okay, I'm a girl, I like guys, I'm a very girly girl, and I didn't question it at all. I didn't think about it. And then when I started getting involved in, more activism, people were asking me like, oh, like, do you like women? And I'm like, well, I don't not like women. Like, oh, maybe I like women. And then of course I had my first crush on a straight girl. I think it's a rite of passage. and, she, and she was like, oh, can you pretend to be my girlfriend while I'm talking to this guy because he's creeping me out? And I'm like, oh boy, can I pretend to be your girlfriend? I can super pretend to be your girlfriend. and she was just like, oh, hi, honey. And she comes up and she like gives me a kiss. And I was like, yeah, I'm gay. I was like, okay, girls are on the table now. This is a whole different situation. So it was kind of like a lot of the like activism and culture came first. And then I was like, oh, I'm in here too. I'm in this club for sure.
I love that so much. Like, I love the way you told this story. It feels like a queer coming of age story, like one that you could buy on the shelf.
Chloe, I need to write this. My next book.
Oh, I love that. For me, it was like very much the opposite because I come from a very small town in Germany. And so I wasn't immersed in queer culture at all. I had to go out and find it online. So I was very familiar with all the different terms, all the labels, I guess, theory behind it all. And then I also started out as a very, very good ally. And then eventually I realized that I was more than an ally. I was, in fact, queer. And yeah, I also had the, rite of passage of having a crush on my straight best friend. It's just a classic.
I swear it's a rule. Like, it has to happen.
You gotta go through it. And so, yeah, I don't actually remember when I became aware that Pride Month was a thing. I remember going to my first Pride parade in Germany as a very tiny baby queer with my mom. So, yeah, I knew that Pride was a thing. And then I think I must have been in like 12th grade when I realized that Pride Month also existed. But yeah, very interesting, the different perspectives.
Yeah, kind of reverse.
Yeah, but still some things in common.
Well, it's this straight friend. It's just got to happen.
Universal. It's a trope for a reason.
Honestly, like that, it has become like a trope in romance novels, but in the romance novels, the straight friend ends up not being so straight.
True.
Because that's the fantasy. We all have this straight crush, and the fantasy is, oh, maybe straight crush isn't so straight. It worked out.
Yeah, heart-wrenching. But it builds character, I think.
Yeah. One of the things when I was reading over some of the things to talk about today, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the question of making your sexuality your personality.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious as to your thoughts on that, because I certainly have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I also have thoughts. So I honestly think that the sentiment is a bit silly. Like, you will never hear that being said about a straight person ever. I really don't like how you're flaunting your straight relationship in front of me. So Yeah, I think that there's nothing wrong with being proud of who you are, especially in a society where your very existence is like still a topic of debate. Um,
Mhm.
and that sense of identity is so hard won in some cases. And I think especially for younger queer people, it's so important to really feel that identity and to, go out in public with your rainbow merch and, show yourself to others and be seen in return. I think there's something very powerful about that. And so, yeah, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's an incredibly brave thing to do.
Yeah, I've always like kind of cringed whenever I hear people talk like that when it's like, oh, there is just it's like it's their whole personality now. And
Hmm.
for whatever reason, so I also am chronically ill, and a lot of times people will do the same with illness or disability, like, oh,
Mm.
it's like, yeah, they're autistic, but it's their whole personality, or oh, yeah, they're sick, but it's become their whole personality sort of thing. And I think that's just such a like it's such kind of a silencing
Hmm.
concept. It's like, I don't want to hear about your identity anymore. And so it's this kind of, convenient way for people to kind of shut down conversation around identity
Hmm.
when it's like, oh, you're making it your whole personality. What that really means is I have decided you're talking about your identity too much.
Hmm.
Like, I have decided that your identity is more than I am interested in, you know, dealing with or interacting with. And it's like I've heard that a lot for for neurodivergence, for any kind of disability, and for sexuality. And it's a lot of these identities that I think people are like not super familiar with. Maybe they haven't
Hmm.
interacted with a lot of people in this community, and because suddenly they're interacting with a person who has a different identity than theirs, they're like, whoa, you're like really intensely gay, or you're really intensely, chronically ill. Like, it's too much. And it's like, that to me just says like you're uncomfortable because it's not familiar to you.
Hmm.
Like you said, like we would never say that about straight people, right? Like, oh my God, they're just so straight. It's just in your face. It's like we never have that conversation. And it's because everyone accepts straight as, the norm, as this is the standard is straight. And so everyone can be that and, be comfortable with their identity and, flaunt who they are and feel
Hmm.
good about that. And that's fine because that is what we decide is normal. And again, it's the same with like healthiness and able-bodiedness. Like there are people who are really into exercise and, they rarely get accused of, oh, you're making exercise your whole personality. And it's like if I were to do something like that and be like talking about, how ill I am or my symptoms or something like that, oh my gosh, I would get so many people just like, okay, we get it, you're sick.
Yeah, I think you put that so well. I really do believe that it speaks more to the discomfort of the person who says that statement.
Mhm.
And at the end of the day, that's really not my problem. I have the right to exist. I'm sorry. Sorry if it makes you uncomfortable, but it is a big deal to me. I think I can speak for a lot of queer people that it is important to my identity, especially because, I am part of a minority. So I think that automatically leads to this feeling of, an in group and an out group. Um, so, yeah, I think that this is just a thing where our society isn't as advanced as it could be. And I hope that we kind of grow out of this.
Yeah. One thing you said that
Another.
I thought was really like perfect is that you said it's a hard one identity. And I feel like
Mm.
that is certainly so true for me. And I think it's true for a lot of people because I think there's this sense of like, you either wake up one morning and you go, oh, I'm, LGBTQ and I'm
Mhm.
part of this community or something, or you don't. And I think there's for almost everyone, it's this journey, it's this kind of, questioning within yourself and trying to figure out who you are and
Mhm.
answer questions that are really complex and not at all clear.
Mhm.
And, by the time you even get to the point where you're like, even telling yourself, like, oh, you know what, this is who I am, this is my identity, that's a huge step. And then saying it publicly is a huge step. And like all of these things, like you said, are so hard won that like, yeah, when you get to the point when you're out and you're like ready to talk about it, it's like, this is a big deal. Like this is big for me. And I think there's a lot of, or really there's not enough emphasis on that, and emphasis on how much value there is in figuring out your identity and, deciding like, this is how I'm going to identify, this is who I am, sort of thing. And every interaction where you address that is another little step. It's another little, like, okay, I'm going to tell this person I'm queer. I'm going to have this conversation. And so I think the idea that like, oh, it's just one part of your identity. It's like, yeah, it's just one part, but it's a really big part. It's a really huge part of your journey as well.
Yeah, and to me, it's not just about, the struggle and all the difficulties that come with being queer, but like, I genuinely love being queer. I think that being queer is so wonderful. I feel like I really get to experience the world in a very unique way. And so I am proud of being queer. So why should I not communicate it to the outside world?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I know that a lot of times when we tell queer stories and we tell, stories that are outside of that, cis het norm, like initially I feel like, even just 10 years ago, a lot of those stories were struggle stories, coming out stories, and kind of how you fight against the world. And like, absolutely, those stories should be told and they're important stories. But I love queer joy stories and, stories where, people are falling in love and finding themselves, and stories where like, even it's like taken out of that modern context where we do have continuous struggles and problems and issues that come up, and, put it in this fantasy world where nobody cares. Like, it's just like, oh yeah, it's a man and he loves a man, and that's, normal. Like I was watching Doctor Who the other day, and it was like a pregnant man, and that was totally normal in his culture. And I was like, I love this stuff. Like, I love when we can kind of have these, these joyful stories, or even these very neutral stories where it's just, it's no longer, we're not kind of justifying queerness or justifying someone's reason why they are okay, why they are normal. And we're just skipping right past that and going, yep, it's normal, and we're moving on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so interesting because I also started out writing, those struggle stories. The very first book that I wrote, it contained so much homophobia, both internal and external. And then after I finished that, I was like, okay, we got all of that out of my system. Now let's move on to something fun. And so from then on, I've really just tried to write stories that bring me joy. I've also been writing a lot of historical fiction lately. And while obviously, it wasn't a queer normative society by any means back then, I still think that it's so powerful to explore those little bubbles or those little pockets in time where there might have been something like acceptance and community, and to really lean into that feeling of queer joy that you've described.
Yeah, I love that. I haven't read much queer historical romance, but I know like it exists, and I've just been hearing lots of talk lately about Bridgerton possibly going in that direction, and I haven't watched Bridgerton at all, and I'm like, okay, I'm in. I need to like sit down and start watching. I need to catch up.
Yeah, I love queer historical fiction. Like, it's genuinely one of my favorite subgenres. It just feels so healing to me to see queer people thrive, even in times where we weren't really allowed to. And to see people really carving out their place in society and finding bits of joy where they can. I think that's just so powerful. And also, the notion that we've always existed. It just always makes me so emotional looking back. Another question that I found very interesting is thoughts on non-queer writers writing about characters who are.
Mm.
What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, we both know this is a big topic of discussion. I think, you know, it's been kind of interesting to watch kind of the public discourse on this, kind of going from, oh, only people with a certain identity should write in that certain identity, and then to, oh, if we're forcing that upon people, then we're forcing authors to, reveal their identity, their sexuality, their gender, maybe things that they haven't come to terms with, or maybe things that they're just not comfortable revealing publicly. And I'm kind of more of the attitude that, like, I think if you're telling a story about identity, then you really need to have something important to say about identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're telling this story where, like, the journey is, the queer struggle and identity and coming out and things like that, like, a straight person is probably not the best person to tell that story. But in the other direction, if you're, writing a romance and it's, it's an alien romance on some planet, and they're queer, and, their queerness is part of the story, but it's not really, it's not really the point of the story. I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot more room to write queer characters, and for, every person to kind of write different identities if they do it well, if they do it thoughtfully. But also, I think that's kind of the difference for me, is, are you telling a story of what that experience is, what that identity is, what that means, or are you telling a different story that includes people who are outside of your identity? I think the latter is fine, and I think the former should probably be left to people who have that experience, and not even so much because I don't think that anyone, can write it, but it's that I think people who have that experience and live that experience, they have the most to say there. They can write it the best. And there are so many identities and so many complexities of life that I think everyone has that story that they can tell well. If they're going in that direction, if they're talking about experience and identity, you have an experience and identity that are important, and you can share those experiences, and you can have that, real life influence on a story. Why would you need to tell someone else's story? Where is that impetus? And I think that why is kind of key, is like,
Mm-hmm.
are you writing this because you're like, oh, the story is that this person is gay and they're coming out. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's not, enough of a story. If it's your story and your experience and your struggles, like, okay, then that's a really informed story. There's a lot more to it. But if that's, the trope that you're using, then that's very surface level. That's not only is that not going to be a great story, but it's not going to be a good story for you to write.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that you really hit the nail on the head. I also think that this mindset of expecting authors to disclose their identity is so harmful, and just it feels so icky to me. I always have to think about Becky Albertalli, and how she just got torn to shreds in the media after Love, Simon got big, because people were, under the impression that it was a straight woman, capitalizing on a queer narrative. And Becky Albertalli then basically being forced to come out. It just, it's such an awful scenario to me, because everyone should have the right to come out at their pace and to disclose their identity to people who they want to disclose it to. So yeah, I think that's a very dangerous mentality that we really should move away from.
Well,
And I also, yeah.
I was going to say, there's an interesting, like, flip side of that, where every once in a while you will find an author claiming an identity that they don't actually have.
Mm-hmm.
And then being like, well, wait, why am I being forced to disclose? And it's like, that's the difference in my mind. If you're going to claim something, and you, like, especially if you're going to claim, like, a racial identity that you clearly don't have, it's like, like, once you start claiming identities, then it's important to be able to, be honest about that. And if people are questioning that, more of a problem. But I think anyone who is otherwise not claiming an identity and just kind of off the radar, I think there's so much pressure there, and there shouldn't be.
Yeah. I also think that, casual queer representation is so important. So I really get so excited when I see it. And, I mean, I don't like to assume sexuality, but, in authors who haven't come out saying that they're queer, like Emily Henry, for example, in Happy Place, one of her recent books, she included a lesbian couple. And I just got so excited to see that casual queer representation. And I also think that nowadays there's so many resources, there's sensitivity readers and everything. So I think if the representation is done well and with good intentions, there's really nothing that speaks against it.
Yeah, I agree. And that kind of, I think, rolls into the question of writing different genders. The only one I've read of yours is the Never Kiss Your Roommate, I think it's called. And so I feel like I'm trying to remember. I don't feel like you wrote in male POV. Do you tend to write in male POV much?
I've done both. Yeah.
Yeah.
Never Kiss Your Roommate was split between a male and a female point of view.
Oh, you know what? That's right. They had the two storylines. Okay, I remember.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting question. To me, writing male characters has never really been an issue or something that I've really thought about much, because I operate under the assumption that male characters, or men in general, real life men, don't think entirely different from the way that women think. Obviously, there are differences in perhaps the way that we cope with emotions or things like that. For example, when I write female characters, I think I tend to write them in a way that they are more likely to seek social support when they have, a difficult situation where my male characters might kind of try to cope with it internally. But I don't think it's that fundamentally different. I have a lot of male friends who I know very well, so I try to keep them in the back of my mind. Or, I have a younger brother, so whenever I write teenage boys, I try to imagine my little brother at that age or something like that. Overall, I don't think that it's that big of an issue. I mean, gender is such a murky and confusing concept to me in general. I don't identify as 100% female. I use she, they pronouns. So I really feel like that whole concept is so expansive, and just there's so many different ways to experience gender that it would be kind of silly to limit myself to only writing female characters. I hope that makes sense.
No, I completely agree. I think I have kind of an odd understanding of gender, because on the one hand, I am cis. I've always identified as female. That's been very comfortable for me. On the other hand, I have this very open mind as to attraction and who I love, and like in that regard, gender is a blank slate to me, like irrelevant. It's like, I always say, it's like hair color. It's like, oh, do you like people with brown hair or blonde hair or black hair? You only get one. You get to pick one, and that's all you get. and for me, it's always been like, that does not matter to me at all. And so when I'm writing characters, it's like, I do think about gender, and I often, will consult, people I know of that gender and be like, does this sound right? Does this sound like something that you would say? Does this, and one of the things I've noticed a lot of is like the different ways that men, especially straight men, will describe clothing versus women. Women will go into like really explicit detail, and, a straight guy's going to be like, it's a shirt, it's pants, like it's blue, and women are like, oh, it's cerulean and it's silk. And then, they have kind of a lot more of that like detail that they'll go into things. But that idea of like, people are people, it usually translates. And I've seen like I want to say it was George R. R. Martin who said that he writes women as if they're people because it's like, he was, I guess, talking about how, realistic his female characters are and where that comes from. He's like, they're people. They're just like men. And I think if you are writing well, especially with that kind of loose approach to gender and not assuming, the strictness of roles or what we expect out of people, then, person can kind of translate and you can switch the gender of a character and it not be drastically different or weird. And I think when it is drastically different or weird, it's because you're relying on stereotypes, you're relying on tropes. And like, sometimes I'll be like watching a movie and I'll see like a female character that is just so ridiculous and so over the top. And it's like, oh, she's, what does she do for fun? Shopping. And like, she has, this very like limited, narrow sense of who she is that's based solely on her gender, that when you do gender swap in your mind, it's like, that would be absurd. That would be insane to put a man in this position. And I think that's really indicative of, a one-note character where, their gender kind of is their personality because they haven't been well formed and they haven't really created a person. They've created, a narrow concept of what a man or a woman is.
Yeah, I think that in many ways, the gender of my characters is the least interesting thing about them. Yeah. And, whenever I write from a male point of view, I think that it's very intuitive the way that you approach it, because, I mean, they're just people, like you said. It's not that different. And yeah, I feel like you can really tell when someone is trying too hard about it and like really trying to get into the male psyche in a way that feels very off. So yeah, I wouldn't stress about it too much, honestly.
Well, I think because they do end up leaning into stereotypes. It's like, okay, yeah. I gotta be male, so I gotta call women bitches or something. And like they try too hard and they're like, okay, what is male? What is masculine? And I think when you're starting a character by asking those questions, that's a bad place to start because you don't want their gender to be the most interesting thing about them. You don't really want to think too much about like, oh, this is the gender of this character and they're very heavily gendered, unless we're talking like that's the point of your story is like they are the stereotype and you're getting into gender and like that's where you're going with it. Like I think for the most part, gender and in some ways sexuality, they're secondary things. These are all people who are also queer, are also male or trans or whatever they may be. Like that identity is important, but it's just not everything.
Yeah, 100%. For me, a lot of the time, the gender of my characters is one of the last things I decide. Like I'll have the entire thing plotted out and know the characters, character traits and their history and things like that. And then, a few days before I sit down to write the first chapter, I'm like, do I want to make them male or female or, something else altogether? So to me, that really isn't a deciding factor in where my story is going to go.
That's funny. I feel like I always have like such a strong visual in mind when I start a character. I just like, I'm a very visual person, visual thinker. And so I usually have like in my mind, like the actor that's playing them or the actress is playing them. And like, I will go from there. And it's like, even when I have like an actress, sometimes I'm like, okay, well, I will take a lot of the character traits directly from that person, especially visually. But then there are times when I'm like, oh, now what does this character like identify as gender-wise? It's not necessarily the same as what this actor or actress identifies as, but it's like I will start with the visual and then work my way to the details from there.
That's so interesting because I'm not visual at all. I can't imagine my own characters. I don't really see faces when I read. So,
have you ever seen the thing about the apple? The idea about if you can see the apple in your mind when you're thinking about it, or if you just hear the word.
Yeah.
Like the word end.
I can see the apple. It's just faces for me that are
Just
really
people or
difficult
no?
for me.
So in terms of like your experience writing online, do you tend to write and update like weekly, or like what is your kind of process for like how you write and how you engage with readers at the same time?
So right now I'm not actively posting to Wattpad because I've just been working away on a novel behind the scenes.
Mhm.
Because I've gotten into the habit of finishing a novel before I start posting it. That's just been, it's just taking the pressure off for me.
Yeah.
But a few years ago I used to update weekly. And then once for one book, even twice a week.
Wow,
But
that's a lot.
yeah, that got too stressful. So now I really enjoy the experience of just taking my time, and then when it's all finished and I'm happy with it and I've edited it, then I get to post it. Yeah, what about you?
I feel like I started, I think my first book I did twice a week, but I also had a big buffer built up. I had 30 chapters written before I started, and I think I ended up with like that book was very long. I think it was like 75 or something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I was always just like so far ahead that I
Mm-hmm.
didn't feel like it was like super high pressure. Um, but after that first book, everyone wanted the sequel right away. And
Oh,
I was like,
pressure.
oh my gosh. And so I think I still did that twice a week because I was trying to keep up with the cadence. And that was hard, but I also feel like there's an element of motivation that comes into it for me, that like there are people waiting for it and wanting it and looking
Mm-hmm.
forward to it. And so I feel like, okay, well, I want to deliver for them. I want to deliver
Mm-hmm.
for those people. But then like moving forward from that, I started doing like once a week, and I take relative, like at least a month break in between books. So I'm not like, burning out or like,
Mm-hmm.
constantly playing catch up and jumping right to the next thing. So I do like having a little bit of a buffer, but it's it's kind of like it's changed my process in a bit, because I think I started kind of funny enough where you are now, where I wanted more like written ahead of time sort of thing, and I wanted it like prepped and perfect, and I wanted the space to write, and kind of have that breathing room. And I think in a perfect world that's great, but it does still encourage me to write when I'm, busy and life is hectic and I am chronically ill. And there are
Mm-hmm.
times when like I'm just like feeling crummy for like 2 weeks. And like I don't necessarily have that motivation otherwise to want to write. But I have these fans who are coming back week after week and going, "Where is my chapter?" And they're so excited when I do post. And then it's funny because I go back, they go back and forth between like, they'll be like, "Where's the chapter? Give me the chapter." And then I'll be like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm really not feeling well. I can't do it today." And they'll be like, "Oh, that's okay. You take care of yourself." It's like, but it's very much a loving, like, I want to read this. I'm
Mm-hmm.
excited to read this. And that like that enthusiasm, I think, is such a great motivator for me. And that like I know that I'm not just, talking to an empty room, that like there are
Mm-hmm.
people who are gonna want to hear what I have to say, whatever I'm writing. They're like, they're ready for it. And like before I was on Wattpad, I started like, I don't know, 5 books or so, never finished a single book. And then I got on Wattpad, and I was determined, and I think I probably would have finished this book regardless, because the Siren's Mark series, I really liked it and I really felt connected to it. But like I finished it in roughly a year because it was just like people were there, somebody was engaging with me, and I didn't feel so much like I was talking, to empty space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that sense of community is like the best thing about Wattpad or like posting books online. And I
Mhm.
do really miss that sense of instant gratification of
Yeah.
posting a chapter, the day that you finish it and then immediately getting like a flood of comments. That was definitely a huge motivator. Um, but yeah, for me, it just goes back to the topic that we talked about in the beginning of like trying to get back that childlike sense of play, where there's very little pressure about everything that I'm doing, because right now I'm just writing for myself, and it's going to be a couple of months before anyone is going to see it. So yeah, I think it's very interesting how my attitude towards that has changed. I can totally see your perspective, and I do really miss it some days. But yeah, I think that right now with, university being super stressful and everything, that's just, a necessary shift that I kind of had to make.
Have you like found that there are things that you've changed based on the reactions that you've gotten or the feedback that you've gotten?
Yeah, definitely. In the very beginning with my first book, which I updated in real time as I was writing it, I really listened to, my readers' reactions to certain characters. There was, one ship that wasn't planned, but readers saw a lot of chemistry between two of the characters. So then I had to kind of, do a little fan service, show the people what they wanted. And I thought that was really fun. Also, now that I'm not doing that, not writing and then immediately posting and then writing the next chapter, I've taken a lot of notes for edits. So, after I post the whole book, I see people's reactions on it. And then when I go to edit it and write a second draft, I will keep their reactions in mind. I think that's super valuable. It's like having thousands of beta readers. So yeah, that's been really great. What about you?
It's interesting. I think like I've just kind of like ended up already doing the fan service unintentionally. Like because like I will just write things that I want to happen, and then people will be like, oh, I really hope you do this. And I'm like, I've already written it.
Love that.
It's in the pipeline, it's on its way, sort of thing. Like it's often the one thing I didn't do is actually kind of funny to me. I have two characters. One of them is a lesbian, and one of them is a man who is pansexual, and everyone wants them to get together. And I'm like, she doesn't like men. Like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I'm letting everyone down there, but she doesn't like men. And so it's a hard sell, sort of. But like, I think often the reactions have been kind of what I wanted. And like I'll see like if I'm kind of trying to intentionally mislead and like make them think something else is gonna happen. And people are like, oh, I know what's gonna happen. And I'm like, good. Like that's what I was going for. But there have also been times when like no matter what I do, people are so certain of something. Like in my first book in Siren's Mark, everyone is convinced that she's going to get pregnant the whole time. Every time like anything happens, like because she's chronically ill, right? And she gets nauseous, and they're like, she's pregnant, and I'm like, no, she's chronically ill. Like, and it's like, okay, next scene, like, oh, she doesn't feel well, she's pregnant. I knew it. It's like, guys, no.
Oh no.
But I just like, for whatever reason, they're just like, they're so certain she's pregnant anytime she's not feeling well. And I'm like, that would be very convenient if like her whole sickness could be solved in 9 months. But like that's not how it works. Actually, speaking of which, that was a request that I explicitly did not go with, is that they wanted her to be cured. And I understand the concept. I would love to be cured and healthy, and that would be great. But I explicitly wrote this character because I wanted representation for people who are chronically ill, for this community where it's like, it's not like acute illness. It doesn't just magically get better. You're not like sick for a week and then you feel good again. It's complex, it's lifelong, you have to deal with that. And I still wanted this, sexy, fun woman who was having a romantic adventure and, fighting demons and things. And she's chronically ill. And I thought that was kind of missing. And I got a lot of comments, why didn't why didn't she get cured? Why didn't she get fixed, sort of thing. And that narrative is such a, over perpetuated one in media, is, you're sick and you get better. The story is kind of either sick person gets better or sick person dies. And it's like, for a lot of people, sick people don't get better, or they kind of get a little better, they get a little worse, they have good days, they have bad days. And I wanted to show that. And so initially there was kind of that feedback of, she needs to be fixed at the end, everything needs to be wrapped up, sort of thing. And I kind of stuck to my guns, and I was like, that's just the one thing I feel like I really don't want to change. And I eventually did get a lot of feedback from chronically ill people going, I love that she's not better at the end. Like, that is important for me, and that makes me feel seen and appreciated, and that I don't have to be fixed to be loved or to be, happy. And, you can have your happily ever after and never be, this healthy, perfect, able-bodied person. And so it was like, that initial feedback was, it was kind of like, uh-oh, I hope this is going to play the way I want it to, and people will get it. But on the other end of it, it was nice to see that it did kind of work out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's super important to kind of learn to drown out the noise and really focus on the things that, resonate with you, because you know your story best, you know the heart of your story. And so sometimes you have to break your readers' hearts, but that's just how it is. And I think the story that you just described sounds beautiful. I really want to read it now.
In this part, Lux Raven opens up about what her chronic illness is.
Oh, yeah. So in terms of my chronic illness, I have several, because I have kind of, I'm catching them all like Pokemon. I have narcolepsy and kind of a trifecta of illnesses, which are POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, EDS, which is short for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and MCAS, which is mast cell activation syndrome. And they're this kind of group of things that tend to go together. Mast cell activation is kind of short for, I am randomly, intermittently allergic to anything, which is not fun. But it's there are ways to cope, and there are options and treatments and things like that. And then EDS is basically my body tissues are a little loose. So like my veins and joints and things like that are a little extra flexible, extra bendy. And that leads into POTS, which is when I stand up, the blood doesn't quite go to my brain. And it's kind of, they all kind of feed into each other and cause kind of a host of multi-systemic problems. It took 6 years to get those diagnoses. It was this like long process of, I have no idea what the heck is wrong with me. And that is a very discouraging process, but it's also something that I included in my book. The main character, Ava, being chronically ill, I had for most of the books her kind of not knowing what was actually wrong with her. And people kind of, thought, oh, she's magical. Like, wouldn't that have been great if that was the answer to my problems? I would actually have magic. But it's something that I think is really rarely talked about, is that long process and that long journey of being sick and not having answers and not knowing exactly what's going on, and kind of how that affects how you see yourself and how other people see you. And I've since talked to so many readers who have that exact same experience, who are like, oh my God, this is me, or oh, this is my sister, this is my mom, this is someone in my life who has experienced this. And that was really the goal of writing a character who had kind of my experiences. And I'm kind of at the point now where I see this as, unfortunate, but an opportunity, because like there are days when I'm like, I am so tired of being sick. I do not want to be sick today. I do not want to feel bad. But there are also days where I'm like, if I can tell this story, if this is, my way of connecting with people and allowing people to feel seen, and, getting that out there in whatever way I can, I think it's kind of, making lemonade out of lemons in a way, sort of, where I do feel like it has worked out how it's supposed to, and that I'm able to connect with people over these things and that sort of thing through writing.
Very resilient.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a process. Some days I'm very not resilient.
No, but honestly, your ability to write all these stories, I've seen your profile, you have so many of them. With all of this going on is so impressive. Like,
It's so funny. Sometimes people say that to me and like, I'll just be like, some days I really don't feel impressive. Like there are times when I'm like, oh yeah, I'm doing great. I'm getting productive. I'm getting stuff done. And then there's like, just like a whole week where I just feel terrible and I just lay around and do nothing. And I'm like, oh man, if they saw this, they would not think they would not think I was impressive in nailing it. But I think what it comes down to is that there is so much that we only see from the outside. And so like, we don't see other people's struggles. We don't see a lot of this stuff that, I work to actively talk about and be comfortable sharing with other people, because it's that instinct to shut down conversations when you feel vulnerable or when you feel like you're not showing your best self and your best side. And I try really hard to show that, to show people like, look, it does look like I have it under control, doesn't it? I'm a mess just like you, I promise. like there is both sides of that, and we see so much of those highlights of other people's lives, especially with social media. We see like, oh, look at all the successes they have, look at all the amazing things they're doing. We don't see kind of all the behind the scenes stuff that they're struggling with. And it seems like when you do share your struggles, it's like, oh wow, like you're doing all this stuff and you're struggling. And it's just because I think so few people are sharing that, are really letting you kind of see behind the curtain and see the things that make their life more difficult. And it does seem more impressive, but I think anyone looking at anyone else's life, it seems like, oh, they're doing so well, they've got it under control.
For sure. Yeah, and Philline, you were saying it was impressive. Were you going to add anything else?
Yeah, I was going to add that I'm sure that your stories mean so much to so many people, and it must be so powerful to finally, see yourself in literature, because I have read so few stories where chronic illness was even brought up at all.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I saw kind of something that I was missing, and I was just like, well, if no one else is going to do it, I'm going to do it. And I honestly thought writing it, like nobody was going to have any interest. I thought it was just like this niche thing that I was going to do. And if anyone was going to read it, maybe it would be other people who are chronically ill. And I think what's great is that there are chronically ill people who will read it, but there are also not chronically ill people who will read it. And, just that there's more people kind of that I'm exposing to the idea that like, oh, hey, sometimes people don't get better. Sometimes, health is part of their struggle, but it's not, necessarily everything you need to know about them. And, I think that's what's so cool about representation in general, is connecting with people, because I don't even sometimes think about, rep all the time. I'm not necessarily going in going, okay, am I going to represent, this, racial identity or this gender identity or whatever it may be. Like, I just kind of make the characters. And then I'm sure, Philline, you probably get this too, where you're just kind of making characters and people are like, oh my God, I'm so glad you featured this thing or this person. And it's like I wasn't even thinking about, making sure that group is represented. I was just doing a character, kind of creating, but those representations are meaningful to people. And I am constantly reminded by my readers that those representations do matter. And that's why I try to, go into future books being at least explicit, because there are sometimes when like I am just kind of oblivious sometimes to thinking that everyone knows everything about my characters that I do. And so like at some points, one of my male leads is Indian, and a lot of people don't know it until I say his last name, which is quite a ways in. And I only recently realized that like I don't explicitly say he's Indian anywhere, and people are really excited when they hear his last name. And I'm like, I just didn't say it. Like, I didn't even think about it because I think like, oh, I've got my little character sheet. I know what they are, you know, and I'm not always explicit about it. And it's kind of a good reminder to be explicit about it because people do respond so well to seeing something that they relate to seeing something that they connect with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, everyone wants to be seen. And so to be able to provide that to people is such a powerful thing. So yeah, I think it's probably my favorite part about writing to, get to reach out to people and kind of give them something, and then hopefully see their response.
Yeah.
Wow, I guess the last thing would be, um, what would you recommend to authors, the both of you, in terms of overcoming any challenges? And then I want you to also talk about any of your work that we should be on the lookout for in the future.
Okay. I'll go first. Um, I think I think the key is, it's kind of plays into what I was saying a minute ago, where I think there is this idea that authors that you see are just like making magic. They're making work appear from nowhere. And like all of a sudden they have hundreds of thousands of words. And you're like, how did they do it? Where did it come from? Sort of thing. And I think it's important to remember that everyone's process is different. Your process is going to be different. Your experience of that process is going to be the nitty gritty details that you are not seeing of every other author's process. And there are authors out there who are just, hey, they're magic. They make words, they appear, like those people exist. But the vast majority of us are just, we just keep pushing. You just have to like keep writing, keep putting something out there, keep putting, word to page. And, like Philline was saying, like writing that story that is, that is bringing you joy, that is something that like, I want to read this. And I think the same goes for representation. I want to be represented, find ways to represent the parts of your life that are not represented, that there are gaps for. And then in terms of my writing, I'm currently working on a book called Arrow to the Heart. It's a kind of dark paranormal Cupid romance. I've kind of taken a Cupid in a very odd direction. It's currently posting on Wattpad weekly, no more than that. But and it's a couple weeks from being finished, so then it'll be finished and available.
I can only agree with everything that Lux said. I think it's really important to write what brings you joy, to keep your eyes on your own paper and not compare yourself with other writers all the time. Because when you're just looking at people, it really seems like they're just having success after success, but it does not always go that way. Writing is such a rocky experience. It's such an insane industry. So really focus on what matters, which is, your story and the story that's inside you that wants to get out. Um, and I don't have anything coming up in the near future since I'm just slogging my way through my current draft. But I published a witchy young adult romance last year, which is called Love and Other Wicked Things, which you can get in bookstores if you want to support me, and which I'm very proud of. So, yeah.
Well, it was an absolute joy and pleasure to have you both on. Thank you so much for making the time and being so engaging. And I could not have a better pair to do this type of show on my platform. So thank you so much and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. I had such a great time with you, Lex.
Yeah, it was so great meeting you both.
Absolutely, likewise. And thank you so much as well to all the viewers, the listeners, anyone out there. Until next time, so booking cool.